Hello and good afternoon friends. Welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on comparative politics. Dear friends, we would be continuing with the comparative politics in our forthcoming sessions also and would be covering the topic in detail. Today under comparative politics, we would be specifically covering the nature, scope and approaches of comparative politics. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dear friends, to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, you can call right in the studio, and for that you need to call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1800-110-430. Dear friends, you are requested to call in the last 10 minutes so that lecture flows uninterrupted and your queries are also resolved in the last 10 minutes, that is from 2:50 to 3. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to get in-depth knowledge on what comparative politics is. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji, and good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on the theme comparative politics. And particularly we will be focusing on nature, scope and various approaches which have been adopted in this area of political science, that is comparative politics. In fact, one thing we should bear in mind at the very outset, that comparative politics is a core component of political science, along with of course political theory and international relations. Of course, public policy and public administration also can be included in these core areas. But comparative politics has been evolving since ages. For example, Aristotle, who is known as father of political science, is also credited with this view, particularly in terms of his work and his method and the way he classified constitution. It still continues to be a very important source to understand various political systems in the world. But in ancient time, definitely, in fact, this enterprise was there, comparing systems and then deciding about the ideal type of political system which could be attempted, which could be, tried, and ideas to develop ideal system for a society. So these things were going on, and continued with Polybius, Cicero, and later on, particularly in early modern period, we have had many eminent political thinkers who basically reflected on these issues. But one thing we should remember, that this comparative politics, in fact, by 19th century, particularly mostly United States of America, started acquiring a new meaning, and perhaps this is what transformed this entire enterprise called comparative politics. For example, in fact, earlier when this under comparative politics, whatever studies were done were mostly in normative form or institutional and constitutional in nature, and particularly the study used to concentrate on one particular country. But gradually, what happened? A transformation started taking place. And this is how now we call the emergence of the modern approaches in comparative politics. We will come to this issue later, that how traditional and modern approaches are basically differentiated, and how scholars try to make a distinction between the traditional approach and the modern approach. But this issue of approaches, of course, will come much later in our discussion, because this entire discussion on comparative politics I have divided in two parts. So today is the part 1. So we will be focusing essentially today on the nature and scope, and then we will also take up this question of approaches. So what happened, that by the 19th century, in fact, what happened is United States of America, a lot of new developments were taking place, and therefore comparative politics also came under the influence of these changes. In fact, what happened, that earlier when we were talking of comparative politics, we were mostly dealing with comparative governments, that we were comparing governments in the constitution. But now particularly by 20th century, a new awareness dawned on the political scientists that it is not only government which is important to classify and to compare, but it is also important to know about peoples, their behavior, their culture, their conduct, and therefore overall situation which prevails in civil society. So therefore, what we find that earlier the focus was on a state, government, various institutions, but now gradually within this study of comparative politics, focus started shifting towards civil society, and particularly the agencies of civil society. And therefore, we find that the modern approach, by the time in 20th century the modern approaches emerged, there was complete transformation of this comparative politics. In fact, Blondel, one of the leading expert on comparative government and comparative politics, in fact he makes a very interesting observation while differentiating comparative government and comparative politics. Blondel says that comparative government, when we talk of comparative government, what we imply by comparative government is the politics within the state. Number two, the focus on state and institutions, not much on civil society and the people. And the third, it is essentially legal and constitutional in approach. So therefore, this is perhaps the essential features of the comparative government when we talk of comparative government. But when you start discussing about comparative politics, and this is how the modern approaches emerged, and this is how modern approaches took up these issues, then the entire focus shifts from the state to the broader approach to politics, and politics is discussed in a general fashion, and also politics outside the state. So it is no longer institutions, it is no longer the state, it is no longer the functionaries of the state, but also the agencies of civil society, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact, it is not just simply a semantic difference in terms of this government and politics, comparative government and politics, but even in contents we find that there is a lot of difference. And therefore, what we find that comparative politics, as we call it today, evolved as the study of government, and then gradually is shifted to the study of politics. And therefore, from comparative government we moved in direction of comparative politics. Of course, one thing in fact is also to be remembered, that so far as the method of comparative government and politics is concerned, there has always been a debate on this issue, and in fact there is no unanimity. In fact, again one should remember what Blondel had to say. He feels that prior to 1914 there were two forms of, so far as the method is concerned. One was that until middle of the 18th century, approach used to be mostly normative and philosophical, and therefore we find that in political philosophy, in political theory, all those thinkers who engaged with the larger issue of a state, sovereignty, authority, rights, liberty, etc., they also reflected on this issue of the government, the types of government, etc., etc. So therefore, until the middle of 18th century, the approach was normative and philosophical. And in this approach, we find that often a blueprint for the future used to be proposed, that what type of future could be built through through the ideas which are basically integral to this area called comparative politics. So blueprint for the future, ideal type, construction of an ideal type, often used to be a mission. But from 18th century, what we find that a different type of method surfaced, and different type of method came into circulation, and that was the method of legal and constitutional approach. And therefore, we find that within the area of comparative politics, in fact, a legalistic and constitutional approach replaced the earlier normative and philosophical approach which basically dominated the scene. And of course, between the two, in fact, Blondel also feels that Montesquieu was a very important link between the two phases, because what happened that Montesquieu, as many of us would recall, that while doing a very path-breaking and original study about the classification of, particularly about number of issues in the area of comparative politics, particularly separation of power and so on and so forth, because Montesquieu along with Locke, they are considered to be pioneer in this area of separation of power, the doctrine of separation of power. Montesquieu, while doing this study, took into account factors like climate, geography, geographical location, and on basis of these factors he tried to explain the different consequences and particularly different consequences for the constitution and government in different parts of the world. And therefore, in fact, Montesquieu also made a distinction between tropical and non-tropical countries, that how non-tropical countries were more suitable for a democratic government or ideal form of government in his opinion. So what we find that some sort of ethnocentrism was in this type of approach. It was not only Montesquieu, but many others scholars and thinkers of that period basically took recourse to such method, particularly while making a distinction between the Western and the non-Western societies. John Stuart Mill could be another person who could be added in this list. Even the Karl Marx, when he talked of Asiatic mode of production and found that his entire approach was not suitable for countries like India and other countries because of absence of class and the predominance of a state, absence of private property as an institution. So in fact, Montesquieu was not alone. There were one can say the whole host of scholarship took up these issues to make distinction between Western and non-Western while making comparison. Of course, Montesquieu's purpose was to basically make observation about the form of government, about a democratic system and so on and so forth. So therefore, we find and in fact Blondel observes that Montesquieu is a important link between the two phases, the normative, philosophical and legal and constitutional. So this is how basically we can say that comparative politics started moving from the terrain of philosophical and normative approach to something more constitutional and legal. Now in fact, before we move further, we should also discuss that why comparative politics is important. What is so significant about comparative politics? Because in comparative politics, what we essentially do, that we make comparison. Comparison between systems, comparison between governments, comparison between constitution. So in fact, comparison is at the heart of this analysis. Now of course, why comparison? This question often comes up when a student of comparative politics comes to study this area in political science, that why comparison? In fact, when we take up this issue, that why comparison, then in fact we have to basically discuss that what is the purpose behind doing this type of comparison. Because when comparative politics started in its earlier incarnation as comparative government, focus often used to be on one particular government, and seldom the comparison used to be made between one government and the other. But later on, particularly when this entire quest for scientific method and objectivity started in political science, particularly in light of behavioral revolution and so on and so forth, which we will discuss later. In fact, this entire enterprise or business of comparison became very significant, because the entire attempt in this period when political science was under a spell of this positivism, or the mission was to make it as scientific as natural science. In fact, what scholars tried to convey that there is a difference between social science and natural science. That difference no one can obliterate. But given that difference, how can we become more objective and how can we become more scientific? And that was basically the posture. And in order to make it more scientific, they thought that natural science has the luxury of having laboratory conditions. They have laboratory to test and to experiment their research. But social science, like political science, doesn't have that control situation within a laboratory to test their findings and to do research. Therefore, the social scientists cannot recreate the condition to test a hypothesis or retest it, and this process can go on. This is what is called in natural science the trial method, that a longer period of trial, and therefore ultimately when the results are declared to be scientific, before that a very rigorous process of test and trial goes on. And this is what experimentation makes perhaps it scientific in terms of its perfection, in terms of accuracy, and so on and so forth. But therefore, it is argued that in political science such artificial conditions cannot be manufactured like natural science. Then what is basically the option? The option is that political science and comparative politics as a branch of political science has to take recourse to comparison as a substitute for laboratory condition. Because what happens that by comparison, meaning is searched, analyzing dissimilarities and similarities. Therefore, what happened that comparison became a substitute for artificial laboratory conditions under which the natural science tries to bring out scientific results. So, comparison here means to analyze in similarities and dissimilarities. Comparative politics in fact also allows through this through this method to contextualize the analysis. So, this is how we find that the comparative politics basically considers comparison as a very important tool for arriving at a result which could be called scientific. In fact, if not purely in natural science terms, but nonetheless scientific because of its accuracy and perfection. We will come to this issue later because there are a lot of debate. This entire behavioral revolution in political science which heralded a new era in area of comparative politics. That was basically a revolution meant to bring such type of scientific touch to this entire enterprise. Of course, behavioralism led to many new innovations in area of comparative politics, and two of them are very significant. One is the system approach associated with David Easton, and another is a structural functional approach associated with Almond. But we'll come to this issue later. But this modern approach and behavioralism system and structural functional approaches are considered to be the modern approaches in area of comparative politics, while the traditional approach is of course the institutional, legal, and normative, and so on and so forth. But this behavioral revolution also led to a lot of reaction and resentment. A lot of criticisms came, and interestingly the person who was responsible for heralding this revolution, Easton himself in 1969 started another revolution which is known as a post behavioral revolution, when he gave that famous speech in American Political Science Association meeting, a conference, and he talked about credo of relevance, and he believed that whatever was done in this era of behavioral revolution in name of scientific approach was rather wastage of time and resources, because humanity didn't gain much out of this, and therefore he called for a new method, new awareness, and this is what basically we know as post-behavioral revolution. Because in a spell of behavioralism, what had happened, that facts and values were separated, normative approach was consigned to dustbin, the theory was simply discarded, and a lot of things were happening. A statistical method, quantification tools and techniques, they were fetishized, and number of attempts were made to make it as scientific as natural science. But gradually they realized that there is inherent limitation in human sciences like political science and comparative politics. Therefore, with the even best of our intentions and attempts, we cannot replicate the method of natural science in social science and humanities. And therefore, in fact, instead of going after this business of making it as scientific as natural science, we should understand our limitations and try to basically make intervention in arena of politics, where a better understanding of what society could be attained, where in a better way the society could be governed, where better institutional design could be prepared. And this is how this new awareness came. And later on we find that within modern approach many new refinements took place. to the extent that now again there is a revivalism of institutional method in comparative politics, of course with a different name. Now it is called new institutionalism, which we will also discuss in our two-part discussion on comparative politics. But of course this new institutionalism is different from the old institutionalism. What are the differences are very important to remember. So this is how basically we have seen that the approach which replaced the traditional approach also met with similar problems, and therefore comparative politics in fact over the years we can say that has been going through number of trials and experimentation, and different approaches have surfaced, and this is very natural because there is nothing final in social science, because finality should not be the language of human sciences, and therefore new ideas come up, new approaches surface, new ways to understand social and political reality is basically conceived, and therefore so much transformations over the years. But nonetheless there is some continuity in terms of the significance of institution, government and the state. And I should mention here one thing, that in this under the spell of this behavioral revolution, particularly after the advent of this system theory, system approach, state as a unit of analysis in comparative politics was completely discarded, and it was replaced by political system. State was considered to be an abstract idea, and political system was considered to be more concrete, a reference point for a study. So therefore, of course, getting inspired by anthropology, sociology, psychology and other disciplines, which of course behavioralism was, because Charles Merriam, who is considered to be the architect of behavioral revolution in political science, in fact was heavily influenced by psychology, and many developments which had taken place in area of sociology, anthropology, had equally influenced these scholars. But political system approach, which is associated with the name of Easton, in fact Easton was drawing on many eminent anthropologists like Radcliffe Brown, Malinowski, Talcott Parsons, and Talcott Parsons' pattern variables, where he differentiated between traditional and modern societies, directly influenced David Easton. So therefore we will come to this issue that how this entire political system was imported from other branches of social sciences, and of course with the mission to make comparative politics a scientific enterprise, where the results, the findings, the conclusions could be uniformly or universally applicable, where it could be tested in any situation. The kind of perfection and objectivity we associate with natural science, the same objectivity we can ascribe to comparative politics as well. So this is what Easton tried to do through this system approach, and of course Almond and his friends Powell and others also refined it in a different way when structural functionalism came into existence. But of course the source of inspiration for both remained the same, the sociologist and the anthropologist, both for the system as well as for structural functionalism. In fact, structural functionalism name also suggests that how this method in sociology and anthropology was imported in comparative politics. So this is what we have seen, that this transformation from traditional to modern took place, and this transformation resulted into a lot of debates, a lot of controversies, and a lot of new issues and new arguments coming to the discussion, which have to, in some sense we can say that has enriched this entire enterprise called comparative politics. Now before we move further, in fact we have to take into account that why this comparison. First of all, we have seen that comparison is at the heart of this enterprise. Why comparison is at heart? We have already mentioned that unlike natural science, you can't have the luxury of having laboratory to test your findings. So therefore comparison becomes substitute for the method and technique of natural science in controlled conditions of laboratory. So therefore comparison is important. Now the next question comes, that why comparison between countries? In fact, what we often find that in this area of comparative politics, comparison is often done between countries, two countries or more than two countries. Why this is considered important? Now, first, it is believed that by doing this, one gains knowledge. In fact, this enables one, to do a comparison of a to do comparison at macro political level to find out more about politics in different countries. Because doing or knowing one country, the entire experience may have a localized significance, but if we do it slightly at a more macro political level, then we gain by having the richness of experiences before us, and therefore this gain is significant from the point of view of knowledge. Number two, it also helps in understanding our own country. In fact, if you know other countries and then if comparison is made, then even if you are interested in understanding your own country, this will be useful in terms of understanding the functioning and the nature of power and political institutions. And next, equally important so far as this knowledge business is concerned, that verification of the behavioral trends and the patterns of the people in not one country but across countries is also helpful in terms of enrichment of knowledge. The second is that by comparison between countries, we evaluate good practices which are associated with different government. For example, what do we mean by these good practices? Now, when you say good practices, every system evolves or innovates new ways to formulate policies, to implement policies. Every system develops as a response to its own challenges, and therefore, in fact, unlike natural science, we cannot claim that in political science or in comparative politics there is a leap of knowledge after every few years or a paradigmatic shift in Kuhnian perspective. But definitely we can say that a lot of innovations have happened, and that's why we find that we started with the Anglo-Saxon world, particularly the British system, and the advent of parliamentary democracy, the advent of number of political practices based on customs and traditions led to another set of innovations when it reached United States of America, be it federalism, be it judicial review, or constitutionally enshrined fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. Similarly, in continental European context also we have seen number of innovations taking place in France, Germany, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. When we moved outside this European Anglo-Saxon world, we have had this Commonwealth countries like Australia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and we have seen that how many old ideas, old practices, old way of institutionalizing power was further fine-tuned, and in that process new practices evolved, new institutional design emerged, which is known as a Commonwealth model of federalism, which is a combination of federalism and parliamentary system. So therefore, we find that innovations took place, and therefore when we make such comparison, we evaluate good practices from one country and after another, and through this evaluation we basically reach to certain conclusion. And the next is objectivity, that in order to make the study more objective, in order to overcome the criticism of ethnocentrism, which was perhaps leveled earlier, this comparison between countries also help us to develop a more objective understanding of the subject. So therefore, comparison between countries is important aspect of comparative politics. therefore, in fact, this issue that why comparing countries is significant in comparative politics has to be seen in terms of 2-3 interrelated facts. The first, that it enhances knowledge. Number 2, it helps in emulating good practices undertaken by a particular country. And the third is that it enhances objectivity as well. And this objectivity part is very important, because earlier what was happening, this area of comparative politics, whatever researches were done or whatever ideas were put forth often drew criticism along this line that it was ethnocentric in its approach. When I talk of ethnocentrism, what I mean that experiences from one cultural milieu, one cultural setting is universalized and generalized. In fact, in other words, one can say that the thinkers, the scholars use the culture of their settings, their own surroundings, their own location, geographical cultural location, as a prism to look at the entire world. They find that whatever result comes out of their research in a particular setting can have universal application, and at times this leads to a lot of ideological biases, normative contents, and also lack of objectivity. So therefore, this ethnocentrism in fact is sought to be overcome through this method of comparison between countries, because even if some biases creep in through the researchers' cultural and geographical location, but nonetheless when they are pitted against, or they are basically put against other experiences, then in that process one can find out the differences, the similarities, the limitations, the strengths and the achievements, and therefore some sort of objectivity can emerge. So therefore, in fact, it is believed that this comparison between countries helps in systemic and scientific approach to analyze, specifically in areas where experimental conditions cannot be used or context cannot be replicated exactly. In that condition, in that situation, perhaps comparison becomes very useful. So therefore, this comparative technique, it is argued, is an excellent opportunity for the experts in comparative politics to assess that how general hypotheses can be applied in different contexts. Of course, in fact, before making assertions universally applicable, if they are basically processed through this approach, this method, it is believed that some sort of objectivity can be claimed. Therefore, what we find that comparative politics is an attempt to make a political analysis more scientific. There is no denying the fact. Of course, this is perhaps how we understand the transformation from traditional to modern. Of course, the traditional approach didn't have this mission in mind, because they were hardly doing comparison between countries or across the countries, with some exception. We will come to this issue, that how they essentially focused on particular system, on particular institution, be it Walter Bagehot, who focused on the parliamentary system in Britain, or for example one can say Dicey, who focused on the rule of law, and similar other scholars who concentrated on one issue, one unit analysis. Their entire purpose was to understand or do in-depth research on a particular theme instead of making these comparisons. But gradually, when we find that this new awareness dawned on the scholars, when this new sensitivity came, then we find that the quest shifted in direction of making it more objective and scientific, and comparative method therefore emerged as a very good substitute for this tools and techniques of natural science. Of course, later on we will find that how within this comparative politics itself, particularly in era of behavioral revolution, not only comparison was considered important to make it objective and scientific, rather attempt was more to go beyond it by simply replicating the tools and techniques of natural science, be it a statistical method, survey technique, quantification method, and so on and so forth. And under the spell of this positivism, this behavioral revolution within political science and in comparative politics try to not simply use comparison, but rather try to basically use all tools and techniques of natural science. But that resulted into not substantive gain or substantive enhancement of knowledge, and this is what they realized and soon abandoned it. But nonetheless, comparative method, comparison as a technique to make it scientific and objective, has persisted and has remained valid and significant for this area in political science even now. Even after we find that new transformations have taken place, be it new institutionalism or be it eclecticism or whatever, but nonetheless this comparison as a very useful technique to arrive at some objective conclusion remains there. So therefore, we can say that comparative politics or the enterprise of comparison is an attempt to make political analysis more scientific. But how it all developed? This development is important because it has not happened in one day. It has been evolving over the ages, and this is why I mentioned in the beginning Aristotle and how he studied 150 constitutions of his period and how he classified government, and some of his ideas are still discussed today. And since Aristotle, in different phases in history, in different periods in history, contributions were made by scholar after scholar till the modern time, when we find that altogether a new type of situation emerged, what we call liberal democratic context, under which a different type of institutional design was envisioned, and therefore new politics started. So therefore, comparative politics acquired a new meaning in modern times. So this is perhaps the evolution and development of comparative politics. But before I move to this question of evolution and development of comparative politics, it is important to see that how to compare. One thing is clear, that comparison between countries is important. Comparison as a technique is important to substitute the laboratory conditions of natural science. But then the question arises that how to compare, what type of comparison one should go for, how to compare and what to compare. These are the two important questions, particularly in on this issue of comparison, that how to compare and what to compare. Now, in order to answer these two questions, there are 4, 5, or 6 interrelated facts which we should take into account. First, should we compare phenomena in general? For example, constitutions, parliament, bureaucracies across across countries as many as possible, and the range of representative democracies. In fact, such comparison among phenomena at a more general level, in the range of representative democracy. Is it possible? Is it desirable? The next is that should we compare these phenomena between states? That is also important, within states and between the states. So therefore, particularly the second issue is equally important. For example, American Constitution with French Constitution or German Basic Law. Is it desirable to compare the American Constitution, the French Constitution, or the German Basic Law? Such comparison is also at times attempted, and this is also one important technique in this area of comparative politics. The third is, should we go for historical comparison? And when we talk of historical comparison, what we mean that making comparison between one period and the earlier or the later one. For example, electoral reforms in the early stages of democratization in established democracies with the recent ones in recently democratized countries. Should we make such comparison? Because this is also, we find that a lot of researchers do it. In fact, one thing is important in this making historical comparison, because it helps to know the changes in procedure, policies, practices over time. So historical comparison has its own merit, its own strength and advantages. The way we have advantages in making comparison among phenomena in general, or comparing within a particular states or among the states. So therefore, what will happen that by making this historical comparison, we can isolate the causal factors, which normally, of course, in this macro comparison of the historical comparison, isolating causal factors becomes difficult, because if you lower the unit of your comparison, then isolating causal factors sometimes becomes easier. But if you increase or raise the level of your analysis, the unit of your analysis, for example, if you make it a historical comparison, then isolating causal factors is not that easy. The fourth is, should we focus on large scale comparison? That is also important. When we talk of large scale comparison, for example, based on the secondary aggregate data, United Nations indicator like gross domestic product per capita, GDP per capita, such comparisons, should we go for that? Then similarly, the next is that should we or can we do systemic comparison between a small number of cases to test properties, to test proposition like human rights legislation, more likely proposition like this, that human rights legislation are more likely to be enacted and supported in established democracies than the recently emerged ones from dictatorship. Such propositions can be tested by doing the systemic comparison between a smaller number of cases focused on particular issue like human rights legislation or anti-poverty measures. So therefore, in fact, such comparisons are also in fact at times attempted, and this is also, one can say, the valid way of doing comparison. And the sixth is that most similar and most dissimilar comparison, because when we talk of comparison, normally what comes to our mind, that comparing two similar things, but at times it also can happen that we compare dissimilar things. Now, and then the most similar and most dissimilar comparison is also a very important technique or one important approach or method in comparative politics. Comparison between similar or different things, both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses, and this debate of comparison between similar and dissimilar is a very old one in political science. It dates back to 19th century, and one can remember John Stuart Mill in this context. Now, the question arises that why the most similar comparison among most similar countries or similar instances or similar phenomena is useful, or why one should go for comparison among similar things, because what benefit you will draw out of it, such studies, whatever is similar, because from doing a comparison with a dissimilar thing, you can gain some new insights, but comparing similar things, what benefit will come to you, or what new understanding you will gain out of it. Now, the rationale for making comparison among similar things is that it makes meaningful comparison and theory testing possible, and therefore, for example, scholars give the example like coalition government. Now, coalition government only in the countries where it regularly happens, and therefore, if you compare the coalition government in a country where it is regularly happening from a country where it has just now happened, it can basically tell you that why this happens, what are the factors behind it, what are the causal linkages with this thing, and so on and so forth. So therefore, it helps in identifying factors which can explain differences. By making comparison between the similar things, you can in fact find out or explain the differences. Now, the next question is why comparison with different countries where there is no similarity, or one can say why comparison of a dissimilar situation. Again, there is a rationale for this also, and this the rationale is that this strengthens the application of theory or hypothesis, that if you test your hypothesis or you test your theory in a dissimilar, unfamiliar situation, then in fact the applicability, the validity and utility of the theory is more enhanced compared to the fact that if it is tested in a similar situation. So therefore, both have both strengths and weaknesses. that comparing with the similar and comparing with the dissimilar. So therefore, this is also very important for comparative politics. Now that takes us to the discussion of the evolution and development of comparative politics, and this is what I was alluding to in our earlier part of our discussion. Now Aristotle, the Greek thinker, perhaps is to some extent the originator of many things in political science, including this comparative politics or comparative study, or one can say the comparative government, because Aristotle is credited with the fact that he studied 158 constitutions and then classified them, and thereby he also developed a technique of comparison. Now this classification of systems or the typologies which he gave in fact is very significant even from the point of view of today's time. Now criteria of classification, or one can say the regime system, Aristotle evolved two criteria, and these two criteria are very important. The first criteria was that how many people rule. Before classifying a system or calling a system by particular name, it is important to find out that how many people are ruling there, and number two, in whose interest they rule, whether it is ruled by one, few or many, but the thing is that we have to find out that in whose interest they are ruling. They are ruling in the interest of all, or they are ruling in the interest of few, or they are ruling in their self-interest. So therefore, in fact these two poses from Aristotle became the basis for his entire elaborate scheme of things so far as the classification of government is concerned. Of course, Aristotle arrived at a result in this through this method, which had 6 different types, or one can say 6-fold classification. Of course, one should also remember the basic form in Aristotle was only 3, because these 3 basic forms in his classificatory scheme was particularly related to the number of rulers, that is one, few and many. But at the same time, one should also remember that when the rule is analyzed on basis of whose interests they are ruling, in their own interest or in interest of all citizens, then we have the 6-fold classification coming out of Aristotle's writings and Aristotle's scheme of things, and 3 of it operates out of these 6, which emerges on basis of these 2, the number of people ruling and in whose interest they rule. 3 out of the 6 operates on narrow interest, and therefore they are considered bad in Aristotle's view. For example, they are tyranny, oligarchy and the mob rule, the mobocracy. Similarly, 3 operate on the principle of common good. They are not basically meant to serve narrow interests, rather they are meant to serve the common interests or the general welfare of the people, and therefore they are considered to be better, and they are monarchy, aristocracy and democracy. So this is how we find that Aristotle provided a very sound and very elaborate scheme of classifying governments in ancient time, in Greek period, of course in a different context, but nonetheless this is some sort of kind of achievement for him from the point of view of that period in history. Of course, Aristotle also provided many important insights for studying government and society of the period. For example, Aristotle also argued that the social structure of cities is basically divided on basis of economic occupation of the people, and therefore it is divided between the rich and the poor. If rich dominates, it is oligarchy. If the poor controls the government, then it is democracy. So therefore, for Aristotle, the best regime, of course, is the regime of the middle class, which is based on moderation, which can also ensure stability. And this is how he arrived at his theory of golden mean, a moderate form of government, combination of 2, no avoidance of the extreme. So this is how we find that Aristotle provided a very interesting and very insightful theory for classification of government, and that's why it is believed that all this started with Aristotle, who is also considered a father of political science. Of course, Aristotle's ideas and writings have also drawn a lot of criticism. For example, a lot of scholars say that Aristotle's classification of government is loaded with his own preferences and bias, and therefore it cannot be considered objective. Though of course, even this scientific approach in political science or in comparative politics at times is traced back to Aristotle, that how he wanted to do a scientific study in terms of making it objective. But nonetheless, the critics point out, and to great extent it is also true, that it was loaded with Aristotle's own biases and preferences, and therefore which was of course colored by the situation in which he was writing, that Athens of ancient time. Therefore, one can say that his study or his observation on government cannot be considered purely objective. Secondly, the entire citizenship, which was highly restrictive in that period. For example, women and slaves were not citizens because they were not considered fit to be citizens, and therefore this entire idea of the government was also biased, and therefore it cannot be considered more universalistic in terms of its application or in terms of its justification. So therefore we find that Aristotle's ideas have serious limitations, but nonetheless the insights which he put forth cannot be whisked away or cannot be overlooked. For example, the faith in the middle class, so far as the stability in the government is concerned, is something which he highlighted, but has over the years been a pet theme for many thinkers of different periods in history, be it Adam Smith or Bentham or James Mill or John Stuart Mill. All of them have again come to this view, that how middle class is important for institution building, how middle class can provide a stable government, how middle class can avoid the rule of extreme. So therefore, this mixed constitution, the idea of mixed constitution like this middle class, also something we find its resonance even in the later period, particularly in writings of Polybius, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas and Machiavelli. So therefore, we find that Aristotle's insights, be it the rule of the middle class or the golden mean or the mixed constitution, in fact they are very important even today, and they were important even earlier. In fact, one can say that this idea of mixed constitution was central to this entire Renaissance political theory, and therefore it was integrated into the emergent notion of republicanism, which is basically gaining a lot of popularity these days in political theory. So therefore, in fact, insights of Aristotle are important so far as comparative politics is concerned. After Aristotle, we have another very eminent thinker who also can be considered as someone who contributed in this area of comparative politics, and he was Polybius, the Greek historian. In fact, he was the first person to measure the success of power sharing and differentiation, particularly this power sharing, which is a very important theme in democracy, particularly in modern democracies. So therefore, his universal history analyzed the virtue of Roman system, and particularly the mixed constitution, which was a combination of monarchical, aristocratic and the democratic system. In fact, Polybius compared Greek, compared to the Greek, he explained its success, that why the Greek system was better. In fact, particularly the Roman system was better. In fact, he viewed Roman republics as a manifestation and a realization of Aristotle's theory, not the Greek but the Roman system he thought was the manifestation of Aristotle's theory. Similarly, we find that Romans equally contributed considerably in area of comparative politics when we talk of its evolution and growth, because the first human attempt to provide enduring institution, one can here give the example of Senate, uniform system of laws, university system. All these things can be associated with the Roman minds, and bulk of European legal system today is a combination of Roman and 1804 Code Napoleon or Napoleonic codes. So therefore, one can say that Romans' contribution in area of comparative politics is as significant as perhaps Aristotle and Polybius. In fact, Gibbon, one of the eminent historians, went to the extent of saying that when Romans abandoned this idea of mixed constitution, that perhaps became the main reason for its downfall. So therefore, the Romans' contribution in terms of mixed constitution and a number of other areas like the legal codes and other things perhaps enrich this entire area of the government, the practice of government. Of course, so far as the comparative politics as a branch of knowledge is concerned, these ideas have been integral over the years and we have been building on it. Similarly, European Enlightenment of modern period also basically contributed in its own way in the evolution of this comparative politics. In fact, Hegel, Marx, Montesquieu, all of them are important names so far as this European Enlightenment is concerned. Of course, one important limitation of this Enlightenment, or the scholars or the thinkers of Enlightenment, was ethnocentrism, because they were basically looking at the world from the prism of Europe. They were trying to universalize or basically generalize the cultural experiences of Europe, be it Marx, his aesthetic mode of production, or Hegel, who thought that the Asians didn't have history because history requires a state system and these countries didn't have state. Marx thought that history requires classes and these countries didn't have classes, therefore they didn't have history. Montesquieu, as I told you, made a distinction between on basis of climate, the tropical and non-tropical, and thought that democracy was not a system to be adopted for or fit for tropical countries. So therefore we find that European this Enlightenment also contributed in its own way so far as this growth and evolution of comparative politics is concerned. Of course, the early modern comparative classification, one can say, is great, to great extent is indebted to Max Weber, the German sociologist. And Max Weber, when he made threefold classification based on the authority system, that is traditional authority system, the legal rational authority system, and the charismatic authority system, because this is how he tried to compare and contrast different societies on basis of authority system. This is another landmark in history in terms of this comparative method, because Weber, who is considered as one of the pioneer in sociology, classical sociology, by doing this paved the way for a number of new researches and new ideas. So much so that when structural functionalism, the modern method in comparative politics, system theory and the structural functionalism came in 20th century, they drew heavily on anthropologists and sociologists. And Max Weber's influence on Talcott Parsons, and through Talcott Parsons on Easton, was so significant that many scholars believe that Weber was in fact the precursor of this comparative politics. So this is how we can say that this comparative politics has evolved. But then, of course, the approaches part, that how different approaches have emerged, be it traditional, modern, and within modern, the behavioral, post-behavioral system, structural functional, new institutionalism, structuralism, these things are important to know. And in the next part of our discussion, we will basically focus on these different approaches.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session on comparative politics. And dear friends, the lecture doesn't end over here, as we have already promised you that we would be conducting more sessions on comparative politics. So keep watching us, and yes, keep writing us if you have any queries or if you have any feedbacks at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.